At the end of the day, challenge is what makes a story good. The discrepancy between the hero's resources and the difficulty level of the challenge is what creates tension that keeps somebody reading. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I've written 25 books, published most of them, and I make these videos because there are a lot of authors out there who aren't making it, and I don't want you to be one of them. This week we're talking about power creep. Power creep is when something new is introduced to the story that completely negates or eliminates or invalidates previous challenges that have been overcome. It's what happens when someone in a story gains a new power and then all of a sudden everything is just too easy. Or when a hero is defeated and then comes back better than ever with a new power set that completely invalidates all of the hard work that the hero has done. It goes both ways. And as an author, especially an author of fantasy, I find that this is one of the issues I have to pay the closest attention to. While challenge is what makes stories move from cozy fantasy to thrillers, balance is what keeps people reading. And so we need both of those things. We need a high level of challenge, but we also need the balance, because if we don't have that balance, we are incredibly likely to fall into one of two different traps. Either boredom or despair, both of which are emotions that just absolutely kill a story dead. There is nothing like boredom to just make somebody put down your book. And actually, the only thing that comes close to it is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, which is despair. Which is interesting because in both cases, the reader feels like they know exactly what's going to happen in the story. It's just they are on opposite sides of sort of the same coin. So let's talk about boredom first. Boredom is what happens when your protagonist, your hero, is too powerful. Conflict is what keeps a story moving. But it's not the actual conflict itself. It's the question about how or if the conflict is going to be resolved that keeps people engaged. We've talked about this in previous videos. The best hook is the tension of not knowing whether or not the hero is going to succeed. Now, obviously, if you're reading a book, you typically have a sense, depending on what kind of book it is, whether they're going to succeed or not. For instance, it would be a pretty terrible detective mystery if the detective never figures out who did it. It would be a pretty terrible grimdark epic fantasy if nobody dies. So hopefully you can see there that different genres come with different expectations, and when a reader sits down to read it, they are expecting certain things to happen. Boredom is introduced when there is no chance of anything else happening. So let's take our detective story. If I sit down and I'm writing my detective story and I make the villain so inept that everybody can see who did it from the first page, and even my hero knows who did it, then I've just completely erased the need for it to be a detective story. Now, I could maybe turn it into a thriller or something else, but the point is that as a detective story, I've failed. And most people who are reading it as a detective story are just going to find themselves bored. The same thing is true in a lot of fantasy when the main character has too much power. Now, in the genre I write, there's a trope called OP protagonist, and I write that trope almost exclusively because I love it. And it does lead to a problem. If the main character can, with a wave of their hand, just obliterate any challenge, then what's the point? Why are we even telling the story in the first place? And sometimes, when my characters are too strong and I don't set up the challenges properly, my readers get bored. They just say, well, I know how this is going to end. There's not really any point in me continuing to read it because I've read this scenario a million times. I know exactly how this is going to go. It's just not interesting. In fact, in one of my most recent books, boredom was one of the major complaints. I actually just released a video last week where I went through and I reviewed my reviews. And in my 2-star reviews and my 3-star reviews, pacing was the issue that came out. And pacing is an issue often of a mismatch between challenge and skill level. And so that was an instance when maybe I didn't do this well. Now, on the other hand, you can also fall into the trap of inducing despair. And despair happens when the opposite is true. If boredom happens when your protagonist is too strong, then despair happens when your antagonist is too strong. And yes, that is a thing. The reality is that any underdog story requires the suspension of disbelief, because we all live in the real world. We all know what happens when someone who's bigger hits someone who's smaller. Now, we love underdog stories because we love seeing the reversal. We love seeing the underdog, the weaker party, overcome. But if the antagonist or the challenge is simply too big, too strong, then all of a sudden we're left in a position as a reader of saying, I don't think this is plausible. I don't think there's anything that this person can do to overcome this. And even if they do, the cost is going to be too great, and it's going to be a hollow victory. There was a period in the 1990s and early 2000s when there was sort of a tragic nihilism in a lot of popular stories. And the heroes would get to the end and they would win, but it wasn't really a victory. Those stories, thankfully, have sort of fallen out of favor because the real world is not going so well and feels a little bit like that. And so most people aren't reading that kind of story anymore. But I think it's worth pointing out that when we mismatch our antagonist to our protagonist, when we mismatch the level of challenge, that can be what's produced. This sense that even if the hero wins, it's just not going to be worth it. And when that happens, interest in continuing the story dies. And so we have to be careful on either side, right? When I'm writing a new story, I need to understand that if I make my character too powerful, the level of challenge is going to produce boredom. But if I make the level of challenge too high, then it's going to produce this sort of nihilistic feeling of despair, where the readers just aren't going to want to continue. So how do we avoid both of those things? Well, the answer is make sure that you're not engaging in power creep. Or rather, make sure you're engaging in appropriate power creep. So what is appropriate power creep? We'll have another video later this week talking about that specifically. But in short, what you want to do is you want to make sure that every single time you're leveling up your hero, you're also leveling up the challenge. And every time that the challenge inches up, you're showing the growth of your hero. And when you do that, you're going to be able to create a story where boredom is out of the question because there's always an appropriate level of challenge. But at the same time, despair is out of the question as well because there's always a good chance that your hero can win.